I think we'll get started. Let me stand here so I'm caught by the microphone. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming to this event that's put on by the Global Inequalities and Diversities Research Centre. So tonight we're joined by a live audience, thank you very much for coming, and an online audience. I'm looking at you. We can show you your friends in the audience later, the online audience, but this is a hybrid event, so we're very proud that we're able to put on a hybrid event and all of the challenges that come with that. So I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm a senior lecturer in health and social care, and a lot of my students are in the room now, so thank you very much for coming. Some colleagues and other people from the university. In the online room, we've got people from all over the world, and from kind of all different organizations, people who just have an interest in mental health, or people working or studying other higher education institutions. So great diversity in the audience. So this lecture was really meant for my undergraduate students in the mental health module, studying health and social care. But we thought that it was too important of a topic not to open it to the wider audience. So we're really thankful that somebody could join us here and online. So tonight's talk is, like I said, held by the Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Centre, a centre on area studies that develops really world-class research on areas like migration, nationalities, borders, and also issues surrounding inequalities that arise from different social structures related to racism, discrimination, colonialism, etc. So we do put on quite a few events throughout the year. A lot of them are online, for those of you who are joining online, and some are here at the university. So do keep an eye out for more events if you're interested in these kinds of topics. So we're so pleased to welcome Suman Fernando to us today. He's our honorary Emeritus Professor. He has long links to the university, and we have had visits from Suman many times before, but not for a little while. He's here to talk about institutional racism, transcultural psychiatry, and in his more latest work into decolonisation of the psychiatry disciplines. Suman is a retired consultant psychiatrist. He's had many years of service as a psychiatrist. He's also a writer, an academic, and importantly, an anti-racist campaigner. And his work is really impactful, and we're very proud to have such strong links to Suman. And we use your work a lot in our modules, and especially your work surrounding sectioning and the mental health provision towards the BAME population. We used a lot. So the event will last for approximately 2 hours, with around 1 hour for Suman to give us his talk, and then some time for you in the audience to ask some questions. I think it's Orion who's manning the chat and the online audience, so also for the Q&A, both you in the room and the online audience are welcome to ask questions.
With 43 people joining.
43 and about 15, 16 in the room, I think, so that's a great audience. So over to you, Suman. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you, Maya. Thanks very much to the London Met and the research group here. I haven't. I've taken on quite a large topic, really. So we include 3 different topics, as it were, in one. So it'll be a bit of a rush, and I might be very short on things that I feel people know about and really have don't need to be introduced to. And the first is institutional racism in psychiatry, psychology, institutional racism in what we call the side disciplines, which are the others, counseling, etc., that come out of psychology, psychiatry in Western disciplines. And also I'll have sort of break at the near the hour, so that you know whether we going to move into decolonization as the term indicates is what's being done now, or people are trying to do now, or into more about comparing Western and non-Western systems, or the little we know about the comparisons. Anyway, we'll get on to that. Firstly, about myself, I suppose it really, you ought to know something about me, or what I think about me, which may not be the same thing. But I've been here a long time. I'm from Sri Lanka, sort of middle class family there, singular family. And it's, I came to England first in the 50s. Sri Lanka got its independence from Britain, colonial empire, in 48. So it wasn't long before I came here. And I came as to do medicine. I studied medicine, and then went back to hopefully practice in Sri Lanka. But for various reasons, including the that I really couldn't stand it in Sri Lanka. Not so much the general environment, but all that was problematic enough. But it was a mental health hospital, one hospital that served the entire country, which I just could not cope with really. And I came back to England in the 60s. In the 50s, England, I was black. I never knew I was, actually I didn't know I was black. I knew my caste, and I knew my social class, I knew my family, I knew various things about me, my background. But being black, it wasn't really something that entered my consciousness at all. Not even brown or non-white. Race wasn't something that was prevalent there. There were lots of other very problematic divisions, but not race, as known in the West, in Western Europe. So it was a very derogatory term, being black, and it took some getting used to actually. But I became very, very much a part of my identity really. I saw myself as black, particularly when I started psychiatry, and I was dealing with people from the Caribbean, the influx, the Windrush generation, as they're called, not in the health service, workers and nurses and doctors, but things changed, of course. In the 60s, things were getting different because there was a lot of. It was very difficult, actually. I mean, it wasn't easy going through a training scheme with many nearly all white students. But apart from that, in the 60s, there's a limitation of immigration was talked about, throwing coloreds out, repatriation of coloreds. I was constantly called blackie in tubes, etc. This was this sort of environment. But of course, the categorizations changed. It was really, I think, in a way, it was the divide and rule again. It was one black mass of people was too threatening for the white population here, and we were divided into different groups, which was easier to control, I think, from a political standpoint. As Stuart Hall and others who wrote about it at the time, about how these divisions were being imposed and why. It was in keeping with the colonial approach towards non-whites. In psychiatry and psychology, there was I did medicine. I came as trained in psychiatry on the second visit, and I then sort of stayed on really ever since then, but going back quite often at first. In psychiatry and psychology, of course, there was the don't think I'll go into that much, because these sort of issues that were discussed were still there, are still there. It hasn't changed that much. The hospitals have changed, the architecture has changed. It's not much more in the community rather than in institutions, but this hasn't changed. This sort of ambience for black patients. It's less obvious, but it hasn't changed. But that was it stimulated a lot of argument, and the few black psychiatrists and and others in the mental health field really got together in sort of defense positions, and what we formed was called the Transcultural Psychiatry Society, which imitated really the societies in Canada. The Transcultural Psychiatry Society still is very active in Montreal and some of the Canadian cities, and also in parts of Europe. And we imitated that, and to study transcultural psychiatry. It's a sort of academic pursuit. So we get on to transcultural psychiatry. But in Britain, particularly in our Transcultural Psychiatry Society, we soon moved on to race. It was first about culture, differences in culture, etc. Similarities, differences, why people, what psychiatry was, the meaning of madness, etc. But we soon moved on to racism, because that's what our patients were telling us was the biggest problem. And it's racist talk. You asked black patients what was why they were being diagnosed as schizophrenic. It's racist talk. It's like I heard this so many times that time. It's like it's the way it's always been. There's much of it, etc. But in my personally, I soon became colored initially, but Enoch Powell, Enoch Powell's the famous, in Britain it's sort of well known in race circles, the Rivers of Blood speech. Enoch Powell said, forecast that he was a Tory minister, prominent minister, forecast that in 20 years' time there'll be rivers of blood down the streets of London, and they'd be killing by black people, white people. It was essentially the blood. He was expelled by the Tory party. That sort of language was similar to what we're hearing now, and they're not expelled by the Tory party. Invasions. That strikes me as rather ironic, because things have changed a lot in a different way, but it seems to be coming back again. Seems to be gone a full circle almost. So I wasn't colored anymore, because calling people colored was considered an insult, like calling people black at one time was. So I missed that describing or trying to persuade you that racism was behind all this, because there's been so much evidence on this, and there's so much written on this. I wouldn't go into all that, which is the initial work of the TCPS, the Transcultural Psychiatry Society. It was really became a sort of anti-racism society. From the 70s to now, in the mid-60s, I was sort of academic type, and I wanted to do some research. And I found it very difficult to research what I wanted to do, which was about the the black people. And I was black, and the sort of most of the people who from the West Indies were black. I saw myself as one of that. It wasn't black and brown at that time. It was black and black, or black or white. It was one or the other. You couldn't be. You had to be. If you were not white, you were black. That was as the song says. If you were not black, you were white. That's it. And I couldn't get money for that, or get any funding for that, or any support. But I was working. I had trouble getting jobs, of course, and the people who helped me were Jewish consultants who had similar experiences in their early years, I think. And I got quite friendly with these Jewish consultants. Said, well, why don't you study the Jews? It's a sort of equivalent group from the past. So that's what I did. And I produced, ultimately I got an MD on that Jews and non-Jews of East London. And again, this taught me something very, that has stayed with me, I think, ever since. Is that I used to, I did the usual thing, looking at group of Jewish, group of non-Jewish, against non-Jewish, depressed Jews, depressed non-Jews. It's a sort of traditional approach. And looking at social, looking at family relationships, looking at who they met and didn't meet, etc., etc. Look at the social interactions. And as I was doing that, I was talking to a lot of Jewish people, and I realized that actually they were not matched groups. These were supposed to be matched groups. Their experiences in the East End in the 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s was very different to the white groups, which were mainly Irish and indigenous East Enders. And they were not, the basis of my research was false. They were not matched groups at all. Their experience was different. So it was about studying different experiences. That took me into studying race, actually, and racism. Early books from the TCPS was about these by white people. Philip Rack was from Bradford. He'd been, just to give an indication how white people were involved, Philip had, his parents were in military in Pakistan, what is now Pakistan, in the British Army, and he came to know he grew up with Pakistani people in the northwest, and he got a like. And he found that they were having a rough time. The immigrants who were had come to Bradford were often had the same sort of experiences that West Indians were having in the 60s. And not just the immigrants from Bradford, the immigrants from the subcontinent, India, but also Polish people who had come over during the war just before. Again, it wasn't just about being black, but or white, but about being alien, being seen as foreigners, the other. And that's a sort of basis of the racism, I think, that developed. That was my first book. And John Cox again had been in Africa, in the same sort of situation. It led to a study of why why are people racist? What makes them racist? Why are psychiatrists racist? And I was racist. I was very much like my colleagues in the first years as a consultant, until I started examining myself as much as examining my colleagues' work. And I was the same as them. And I think Candy's book, I'll just jump to that now. No, I can't get it. But Ibram Kendi's book I would recommend as really the book that has tried to deal with that and to try and understand what racism really is and how it's come about. But that was in the US. But it does carry the same lessons for us here, how to be anti-racist. Because Kendi says that these days you have to be either racist or anti-racist. You can't be neutral. And for people to say they are neutral, and it doesn't really matter whether you're black or white, it really doesn't carry any weight. And the other big issue in psychology and psychiatry was the overdiagnosis of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is the madness. It was seen as, still is, seen as the diagnosis that indicates madness of the alien, the people who are seen as beyond, almost inhuman in the medieval times in Europe. And Protest Psychosis, again, is another book which by Metzer, which deals with that, and something you can read. And then this book I did in 2017, I thought was going to be my last book, because actually I wasn't being asked to speak very much. Nobody seemed very interested. And I had time, and I was retiring, and I had retired. And I looked at all that had happened, a lot of stories. Institutional racism is a lot of stories about personal, so it's the personal and the political coming together. Where do I go now? Race thinking, very briefly. The notion of race applied to human beings comes really, I think, from othering and combined with what's called race thinking of people in terms of race, which was really Western Europe, which is now spread all over the world. It wasn't, black, white, this yellow, red, these sort of colors wasn't really very important, except to describe somebody, I suppose, but not in the way it was used in Europe. And initially, it was very much to do with Muslims and Jews. They were the two races. So it was a definition based on apparently religion. Well, it was what people thought the religions were, and about the myths and the ideas that had come through the ages, sometimes through Christian teaching, sometimes through other religious teaching, about Jews and Muslims. And because if you look at the history, there is the historical approach. They were the two groups who were persecuted for hundreds of years, Jews and Christians, the Jews and the Muslims by so-called Christians. That was the race scene. It was the what changed into very much a color thing was the the Atlantic slave trade, which was really, I suppose, the economic need of cheap labor or free labor to develop the new world, which the old world, the white world, saw as something that can be exploited. The people can be exploited. The land can be exploited, if not stolen. And they were stolen, most of it. And they colonized, which was mainly colonized, which was colonialism. And from then, it changed to a color racism. Color racism was the predominant dimension on which race was. If you were black on the boats going across, if you were black, you were in the hold. If you were white, you were on deck. You wouldn't see a white person in the hold. You wouldn't see a black person on deck. The division was race, and that carried over into the rest of the colonization that came after the occupation and the colonization of America. They found people who they, anyway, going to what they thought of Americans, but it was also intertwined with how Americans, indigenous Americans, were seen by the white, and the whole concept of whiteness really arose in that setting of white supremacy. If you were white, you were supreme. If you were not white. And then the other divisions that then the scientists of the time devised, different groups of people, different types of people, and the different animals and different types of animals. That's how it came about. And the external appearance of the human body now played an important part in race, particularly color. That was biological racism. That was what we had up to the last, up to the World War, Second World War. We means us, British. We had up to the Second World War. The Second World War, I think, was a big turning point in many ways. For better or worse, I don't know, but it was a big turning point. The Jewish Holocaust, white people being treated like black people. This shocked. This did when the reality was made evident. Then it really did shock ordinary white people. That other white people, because the Jews had become, in the meantime, become white to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent. And that was the racism, the Jewish Holocaust, and the fall of the European empires. These natives were rising up, and they were taking over our land, whose land. This was a sort of underlying feelings that gave rise to recognizing ultimately that race was horrendously destructive to the human race, to the human beings, to everybody, whether they were black or white. Racism was a destructive force. And then what happened in the 70s, 80s, I was through this, I think, experienced this in personally, and many of us did, is that it became so much better, actually. People were actually ashamed of being racist. I got married in '61 to a white woman, and we used to go out together, but we often couldn't get into restaurants, couldn't get into hotels. But this time on the honeymoon, we thought we'd try a posh hotel, and this was typical. We went in and they came out and said, "Well, no, we don't have rooms. We should have taken the notice down about vacancies. Sorry, very, very sorry." So we went off, and my wife phoned up the English accent and said, "Oh, yeah, come along, got lots of rooms, we'd love to see you." Went up there. So I went and spoke to the guy who came out, the owner, and he said, I told him this is what happened. What do you think? And he said, "Well, that's what it is," he says. We don't take back paper. Don't take back paper. And he was proud of it. That's what should be the case. Why are you questioning that? And that's a sort of thing that changed. We reported it to the AA actually, and the AA took them off their list, and which was quite important at that time. If you want the AA list, you don't get, it's an important part of selling your hotel places. Anyway, there's always another thing was that in Britain, wherever there was racism, obviously racism, there was always something else happening as well. There was the AA that was anti-racist. In effect, they didn't say they were. This shouldn't be done. And this was the other thing that I noticed. The other thing that came out of the early research, I said, was, I mentioned that earlier. Let's jump on now. Racism, what had happened was that racism became embedded in the culture, but people were polite, and we were protected from the obvious. Life was much easier for black people than it had been in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. There's a definite change. And we thought things had changed. And then the 20s, and we suddenly realized that actually things hadn't changed at all. As much as they changed, as much they remain the same. That's all I say about racism, except this diagram sort of shows study the history of how psychology and psychiatry developed and the corresponding events in society in general. It would be very odd if actually psychiatry and psychology were not racist, because that's the context in which it grew up, in which our disciplines grew up. These were the sort of underlying ethos in which we devised our systems of diagnosis, devised our systems of making judgments about people, whether they were mad or not, whether they were capable of understanding and appreciating psychotherapy, if you like, intellectual ways of dealing with their problems or not, whether they were just body or whether they were body and mind. And this is the sort of racism that is called institutional racism, that it's very much part of the institution. I've always given references, because if you get the list of slides, you can look up these references. I've stayed, as much as possible, stuck to giving references, because it's not just my ideas, but actually there are ideas that were backed up by nearly enough what we can get doing facts. That's Candy's book I was looking at, which actually also influenced me quite a lot, I think. It came out recently. So what is it? I got interested in teaching, in lectures, in psychology, psychiatry. And the sort of what was really wrong with this? The black students used to tell me that, see, they get a lecture from me or from another black or white psychiatrists who were critical of the of psychology and psychiatry, the way institutional racism affected practically everything they were taught to do, which was right. And why is it? What was wrong with the psychiatry and psychology? I told people, well, why don't you teach people about other countries and other places, or mental health was dealt with differently? I said, but there are no books. Then went away, and there are lots of books. Oh, we know, they are not based on facts, but there are lots of facts. They are in Arabic. They are in Latin. They haven't been translated. No, they have been translated. Oh, no, they're not important. Now that's the racism of teaching, racism of the training we get as to what psychology and psychiatry is about. Psychiatry and psychology dealing with human beings, I thought, should be different. And most psychologists, psychiatrists agreed with that, but also agreed with excluding anything that was not European. Psychiatry and psychology, cultural diversity of the meaning of mind, behavior, social interactions across the world, not just in Europe, not just among white people. Mental health, psychological well-being, and madness is conceptualized across the world. If you're talking about psychology, psychiatry, that is relevant for everybody. To explore how people across the world needing help and support in coping with problems of living, because they're not always interpreted as madness, they're not always interpreted as depression, they're not always interpreted as hallucinations. Hearing voices was not a problem in most outside Europe until about the 40s, 50s, 60s. And now it is a problem. And what's been happening, colonialism, colonial thinking, racist thinking. This is I was just telling Maya, this is an easy book to read, Crazy Like Us. It's by Waters. He's not a psychiatrist, psychologist, he's just a writer. He puts over this basic issue of why psychology and psychiatry are no longer suitable. I think the way it's taught is not suitable for the modern world. Try and get through this very case. So it's about the nature of knowledge that was produced. Information about ideas, concepts, and theories being excluded purposely or by accident in the process of compiling Western knowledge, white knowledge, in American indigenous communities called settler knowledge. In Australia, various places, it's settler knowledge. It's not knowledge. It's not our knowledge. These are the terms that have come to be used and have some meaning. What is psychology? Nicholas Rose at Goldsmiths is a sort of social historian. He's a sociologist, social historian. It's a psychosocial approach. Psychological sciences, he says, have a long history and they have a long past, but a short history. They've only been going for a couple of 100 years. A long past refers to philosophical, political, religious discourse in centers of learning throughout the world. China, Middle East, Africa, particularly along the Silk Roads, Greece, the early science, religions. Many of these ideas are expressed in religion, not as psychology. That's a recent thing. Centers of learning was in the Middle East, India, etc. Moved to Germany, France, and Euro-American and USA, with the difference in wealth. And how did the difference in wealth come about? Was colonialism. It was the initial domination of the New World, and then using the wealth there to actually dominate the rest of the world. That was sort of a very short account of colonialism. So cultural traditions that are medical or psychiatry today can be identified historically in many non-Western cultures, etc. I'm rushing this. These are the sort of books that were very early on, 60s, 50s. Kakars and Leon Hammer, Tibetan psychiatry, psychology. These were when people were saying, well, where are the books? Where is the information? These haven't been written in English. If it hasn't been in English, it can't exist. Well, why aren't they translated then? They are translated. Oh, but they're not important. So why have we not heard about this? Policy to exclude non-European sources, etc. Institutional racism, I keep saying this, but there are the words for it. Blackatina is about the history, the writing of history. Blackatina, I won't go into it in detail. There are 4 wonderful books written by Bernal, who was hounded out of the history elite for writing these books. It's all lies. He gives facts and figures. He gives a lot of facts. They're scientifically researched. The concept of freedom, well, our psychology and psychiatry really started, of course, after the Enlightenment, and was said to be evoked by the Enlightenment ideas. The Enlightenment was when Europe became enlightened. Toni Morrison, I think, was pointed out. Enlightened, yeah. Height of the race, height of the Atlantic slave trade. And when you look more deeply, the major thinkers of the Enlightenment, Hume, Kant, Hegel, reveal that reason and civilization became almost synonymous with white people. All the reasoning, the importance of reason was for white people. And their writing was very extremely racist from our point of view now. Perhaps, I mean, it wasn't then. That was supposed to be good philosophy. So why didn't we know about this now? But it was. There were books about this. Not just Toni Morrison, but books by Easy. When the research is coming out now as global, as research into I think things are changing at the academic level. And today, transcultural psychiatry, critical psychiatrists who try not to be Eurocentric, not to be racist in their building knowledge. View psychology itself as culturally diverse. Lawrence Kerma at Transcultural Unit oops, seem to get on. Oh, as at Montreal says, psychologies are stories of the self in time, ways of narrating our experiences and behavior, explain the basis of actions. Sense of it of self is the interior experience of personhood. This is trying to sort of encompass the various psychologies that are being researched and reported usually as indigenous psychology. Indigenous itself become a word of derision now. It's indigenous, it's not real psychology. No, they are global psychologies. That's so the Institutional Psychiatry book I thought was the last book I wrote, but I edited that with Roy Moodley from Toronto. He's on a collection of articles from Buddhists, from indigenous people in America, in South America, North America, the Maoris, from Chinese, various other groups, to show that really there is a lot of knowledge. Much of it is not in English, yes, maybe in Sanskrit, maybe in Arabic, and hasn't been translated. But if there was a demand for it, they'll get translated soon enough, because people want to sell their books. Lots of academics will do that. So what is it that's stopping us? It's institutional racism, we call it. You know, it's this sort of, we're stuck. We're stuck. And that's not just for white people.
Sorry, Suman, 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Perhaps more serious issues that we appear to have ignored very quickly. So what sort of we seem to have ignored. The early development of humans and much to the east-west, north-south interactions that took place on the Silk Roads. I don't know whether you've even heard of the Silk Roads, but it's become news now because the Chinese are trying to resurrect the Silk Roads for trade. Seem to be able to click this. Oh yes, Silk Roads are all that. I won't go into all that. But the crux of the Silk Road is it was why it was called the Silk Road. These are the connections between East and West in the medieval times. Was this basic Silk Road. These were the Chinese trying to get together again. These are these are the trade routes connecting West and East. And they were really the basis for cultural development. There were universities along these developed because it was over how many? From 120 BC to 100 for about 1,000 years, 1,500 years. So they were the trade routes gave rise to learning, and there are stories of may or may not be true. For instance, of where was Jesus when he was missing? He's missing from all reports between the ages of 14 and 20. Where was he? He was studying somewhere, maybe. He was along the Silk Roads. Lots of there are lots of stories that sort of fit in to the idea that the Silk Roads was the was the basis of civilization that we have inherited. And they were not white civilizations or brown civilizations or red civilization. They were civilizations, which were human civilizations. The statues at Bamiyan that ISIS saw, was it the previous lot, the Taliban destroyed. Remember, there's a big fuss about this, because they were destroying statues, like, you know, we keep doing this, destroying statues. The destroying statues of the Buddha, because they wanted to get rid of the past. They were Greek Buddhas. They were Buddha statues with Greek voices. There is evidence now that there were Greek sculptures working in Beijing, in Peking, in China. There were Chinese workmen in Afghanistan. Statues were in Afghanistan. And this is, it was a civilization wasn't something that was that brown or black people, white people can claim as theirs or ours. They are ours, everybody's. And that's when the Maristans, the Maristans first appeared. They were the Islamic mental hospitals of the Middle Ages. There were no medical type or helping type agencies in Europe in the Middle Ages. They were all mad people, as in many countries, many places. And it was in the caliphates that these developed in the 10th to 13th centuries. Our psychology, and then the mental hospitals. And the mental hospitals and then the psychology. I mean, mental hospitals were for mad people, and it was studying mad people led to the psychology. Psychiatry was 18th, 17th, 18th centuries. This was 700 years before. Mental hospitals in Islam, in the caliphates, many, right from Baghdad, right along Aleppo was a big center with war, mental hospitals, right along the north coast of Africa, being fed by Greek civilization, by Greek doctors, by Greek medical ideas, and Indian, was highly developed in things like surgery, etc., but also other things, and also southern from the roots from the south of Africa. These were the caliphates. This is one of the caliphate, one of the Maristans. These were some of the psychiatrists and the teachers. They were all men. Maimonides was the physician to the caliph at Cordoba, which was the Western caliph. He was a Jewish rabbi, and he was written also on Jewish teaching, historical teaching. But he also wrote on psychology, and he's very clearly first person to describe that mania and depression is called melancholia, and mania were two sides of the same coin. So it's the same illness. It was a very medicalized, not very, it was medicalized, like our psychology and psychiatry. So it medicalized. It was in terms of medical, and a lot of the medical terminology and the ideas came from Greece, and from possibly from India, I don't know, from Greece certainly, and from the south, from as Bernal says, he doesn't say this about, says a lot about civilization. That's why he called these 3-4 books that the Greek civilization was what we call Greek civilization was fed by Indian, African, right from the south of Africa, and European, but not from the north, which is what we were often told, that Greek civilization developed from white people in the north. We developed from black, brown people. And there were a lot of black, brown people in Greece. So this is where the teaching, I'm trying to get over this. Ayurveda, which is from 2000 BC to the present, the Indian systems of medicine, 3 or 4 basic systems. That's what we get in Sri Lanka. There are ways of diagnosis which is not dissimilar from what we've got. So that's sort of underdeveloped. Unfortunately the 400 years of underdevelopment. The time of colonialism was a time of underdevelopment. Most of the world was colonized, and the colonized world was not allowed to develop, couldn't develop, couldn't actually gain from the development that was centered in Europe and latterly in European, in the Europe that extended into North America. I think maybe I'll stop there. Just to show you what you get now in mental health systems in the third world, in underdeveloped countries, in the global south, as it's called, is often a mixture of these. Most of the funding for development since WHO came on the scene, there's been development. Most of the funding is from the US, Canada, Britain, Scandinavia, the European countries. And this is what Crazy Like Us really is about. Unless you're crazy like us, you don't get any money for development. You have to be crazy like us. That's the theme of it. You have to be crazy like the Americans are crazy. Then you'll get money for development. And that's very true, actually. I was involved in a project for McGill in 2007 to 2012. That's what we saw in this is in Sri Lanka and Nepal. I went to a meeting there of people, researchers trying to get money, development studies, and psychology, psychiatry. And they were busy talking. Their one session, or more than one session, was about how you write the applications. The other session was about what you do with the money. It's very different. And the expertise was to write an application where you can get money and spend it in the way you think it should be spent. And there's a lot of compromises in this. So it has to be a plural system. It has to be both, because you won't continue to get the money unless you show that people are crazy like them. And so there's a continuous neo-colonial, we call it, neo-colonial shift of Western systems being spread in Sri Lanka. I can give you lots of stories about this. And this is sort of compromise. This was a rural hospital in Paticalo soon after the which thrived during the Civil War, because that area, the east, was completely cut off for about 2 years from the central government in Sri Lanka, in Colombo. And the local psychiatrist, a man called Ganesh and his wife, were running it. And they developed a service which was quite remarkable, which was abolished when the Civil War ended, because you're supposed to develop, like to get money from America to develop after that. And Britain won't give money for anything but evidence-based medicine, evidence-based systems. So but during that period, about 18 months, they had a system where the hospital was a center for staff. The central government paid for staff there, but they could do what they liked with it. And they were, because the Tamil Tigers ruled the place anyway, the staff were mostly outside. Patients were looked after by relatives who came with the patients. And the staff were with ex-patients or doing preventive work, if you like. And a lot of what they used was a mixture of Western CBT. Everyone was trained in CBT. They never practiced any CBT, actually. They thought it was a joke. But you have to get a training, you have to get a qualification, otherwise you won't get your employment. This really is true, still happening, but it was very much so. And they were, one of the social workers told me, well, this CBT, so got to know him, and he said, don't tell anybody. He said, but I'm a Mulavi. Mulavi are the Islamic physicians. He said, that's what I do in weekends and whenever I can get time off. He said, but don't tell anybody because I'll lose my job. Because you have to have a qualification which shows that you're psychology trained. But all this is leading, so that hospital had very close links with this lady there, who's a traditional healer. I visited her, and I went with a doctor who was Tamil speaking to talk to her. And when he talked, she said, "You don't have to speak in Tamil. You don't have to speak in." I can understand English. And she's qualified in Jaffna University before the war as a pharmacist. She was a pharmacist, and she decided that this wasn't the. Anyway, she decided to train with a local healer, and she was now running a healing service. She was very upset that her only son was not doing that because he was doing computer work. And they all want to do computer work, which is where the money is, quite rightly. In the South, some people who were researching said that biggest problem, a lot of the treatment of psychotics used to be much less now. Used to be with what the British call devil dancing, because to them this was devils, because you wear masks, you were devils, called devil dance. There are types of dance rhythms that are used when you are very psychotic, we say, pretty mad, and said to be very helpful. It's get over your madness, and that's the problem is that it needs drummers and singers, and they get much more money working in the local in the tourist hotels for foreign tourists. So you can't get drummers. They charge a lot. So that system is dying, system of treatment. We call this neocolonialism. I don't know whether it is neocolonialism, but that's what modernization is doing. Because what is recognized by the people in charge who are colonized, like me, we were all colonized. We were actually taught to think that anything white, anything European was better than anything local. And the money has to go in where it is. And this is sort of process that's happening. So this colonization is a process that's happening still in a different way. It's not directly suppressing these, but actually indirectly shifting. The WHO is now generally supports this. Up to about the 1970s, 80s, they didn't. They were taking a different line and trying to get local systems more organized. But the WHO didn't get enough money. The Western nations withdrew their money. Said, well, you can get this from industry. You can get it from the drug manufacturers. You know, why development can be financed by the people who provide the therapies. So this is what colonialism. There's a big sort of conflict between these two forces, the local forces, the people who want to say local systems are better than imported systems, and we colonized people who are in charge say no. We know that the imported systems. We have to get our education. I had to get my education after independence. To get the psychiatric education, I had to come here right up to the 1960s. You had to go abroad, and the government paid for it to go abroad and get your education. Now, the education is given locally, but the examiners are from the European countries still. So this is what it is like. Let us stop.
Thank you, Suman. All right, thank you so much for your talk, Suman. I thought we could open the room for some questions from the audience. If anyone we have a volunteer already, that's great. And also to the people in the online room, do post your questions in the chat, or if you prefer to ask your questions to Suman via microphone, just let us know and I can turn your microphone on. So, Wally, did you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you, Suman, for your insightful talk. I would like you to talk about what I would refer to as the cycle of racism within the discipline, which is what I got from what you were saying during your presentation. Correct me if I'm wrong. But do you think there is a way out, or are you skeptical or rather pessimistic regarding that cycle of racism within the disciplines of psychiatry and psychology? My other question is, do you think othering practices can ever stop within the field, not just based on race, but also other aspects such as gender, age, class, etc.?
There are lots of problems, if you like. There are lots of inequalities. race isn't the only dimension on which these equalities function in our societies all over the world. I mean, but here we certain inequalities are more important sometimes than others. And I wouldn't want to dispute. I'm talking about race, and that's my my sort of inclination has to be to emphasize those inequalities. But there are many others, which I hope others take up. And I often feel that the other inequalities are actually progressing in the sense of being resolved to some extent much more quickly than the racial inequalities. So I think it's justified, certainly in Britain, to emphasize the race inequalities. What was the other?
Cycle of racism.
I referred to it. I referred to the cycle of racism within the psychiatry and psychology. And you were talking about what it was like in the 60s and 70s, and you came back to what it is now, which, from what I got from what you said, it was a bit like we've come back to what it was before, and I refer to it as the cycle of racism because of you mentioned indigenous psychology, or indigenous psychiatry,
Yes.
which is in a way what psychiatry and psychology have always done, and always do, which is othering, look at someone and say, this is the other, and that other is not me. So do you feel like that cycle will ever stop?
That's a very complex question. I suppose it's difficult to answer briefly. The world's changing all the time. Really, it's not that any one thing is changing more and others stay the same. One thing relates to the other. And the politics, the political changes relate very much. I mean, just back in history, the wars between the Christians and the Muslims was crucial, looking back on it, in the spread of our type of psychology and psychiatry. If as some historians say, if the Muslims had won the battle in the south of Spain in 1492, they would have swept up through France into Germany, and we would be speaking Arabic today. These have a very, looking back on it, they have very long-term effects, what a single war, battle can do. And but it's too late to go back to that. But it's so that everything has a effect on other things that are going on. The psychology, so to consider psychology and psychiatry in a separate compartment is not always, we have to do it to some extent, but to remember that it's related to the rest of other changes that are taking place in society, in societies around the world. One time there was a wish, what was a book by Jacques, somebody, had a big effect actually in the 80s, when China rules the world. he's right on history mainly of how China did rule the world actually. Their navies were much more superior to the British Navy one time. For some reason, they didn't use gunpowder to manufacture armaments. It seemed to be their fault, really. That seemed to be where they fell down. It's the Europeans who use gunpowder to manufacture armaments. And that's for some obscure reason. I don't think anyone explained it why. But when China rules the world again, because China is on the up and up in the 80s, when China rules the world, we'll have Chinese philosophy as the basis of psychology. It wouldn't be this psychology if they ruled the world long enough to change it. That's a sort of statement I've tried to say which perhaps encompasses what I'm trying to say, which is that it's not just the psychiatry at the moment we feel in this country really has got to change. It can't go on like this, particularly psychiatry. Psychology has other dimensions that can go on, educational psychology, etc. Psychiatry has really hit, I think, a rock bottom, if you like, or a state where it's doing more harm than good, particularly because of its racism, but also its the way it works out in terms of disabilities and gender, but particularly the racism. It can't go on like this, and it isn't. It is changing. Telling Maya perhaps well-being would be the main illness. Lack of well-being would be the main illness. Stating that when we did our work in the McGill study in trauma and mental health, the Sri Lankan group, the first thing they did was to try and find how local people see mental ill health or mental illness and mental states. And after about 6 months pilot work, they came up with 2 words, Nani Lai, for mental health, 2 words for mental health, Nani Lai in Tamil, and Yahajivane in Sinhala. Yahajivane has equal words in Hindi, etc. Yahajivane in Sinhala. And if you then translate it back, Yahajivana and Nani Lai, translate it back into English, the nearest you get is well-being. You don't get anything mental. And so the way the Western thinking, or our Western thinking is going, is that well-being is the sort of construct that is perhaps going to dominate and push out a lot of terms, a lot of other concepts which indicate well-being, mental things. But no, look at the papers yesterday and today. What this psilocybin, which has in mushrooms, can alter the neurological states. Neurological tests can be done to show the alterations, and that's might cap that, because anything that can be shown on tests like that
It brings us on to the next question, Suman. Sorry to cut you a bit short. So just get our questions
Yes,
from the audience.
it takes it into a, becomes more important. The sort of neurology.
So, so Nicholas from the online audience asks, Suman, thank you for your talk. Could you outline some alternative perspectives on what we might call schizophrenia? How is this understood in other cultures? How could we learn from these perspectives? Thank you.
How would we learn these perspectives? Why do you want to learn about schizophrenia in other cultures? I mean, if you're wanting, what you're wanting is to learn about how what we term what sort of understanding they have about people. I think I put it up on a slide. The sort of ways in which we want to learn, we want to understand how other cultures, generalize, other cultures see the problems which we conceptualize as schizophrenia. They don't. I mean, other cultures don't. They didn't until 1960s at all, I think. I remember, I mean, I had relatives. I mean, I came to England and I was learning about the psychiatric terminology. And I thought, well, this sort of hearing voices, no one's ever talked about hearing voices. I asked people and said, well, oh yes, I went to a meeting actually I remember organized by Birmingham and another group in India. And there I'm losing the thread of my thinking actually. My neurons don't connect quickly enough. They used to. What was I going to say? No, it's gone. What were you talking about?
We were talking about the conceptions of schizophrenia,
Oh yes,
hearing voices.
About hearing voices. There was a group from Britain, many service users, who went out there and they presented the seminar at this meeting on, there were mainly Indian people there, on hearing voices. And as they did here, I used to go to these, and then they have a discussion about hearing voices, come back and then present at the plenary. They presented this at the plenary. And the first thing is somebody got up and said, we decided that hearing voices is not an illness. And these Indians sort of looked very puzzled. And somebody said, well, who said it was? And some, actually psychiatrist, who said he was a psychiatrist. He was, he obviously didn't practice the sort of dogmatic Western psychiatry. He got up and said, oh yes, I hear voices. It's my father talking to me, telling me what I should do. And I welcome that. It's very good, very good. Some others got up and said similar things. And these service users, there were people from England who were colonized like other people too. They said, well, but it's an illness, it's considered an illness. Well, who said it's an illness? I mean, it's, you hear voices, you hear people. And look at the history of this to some extent. in many areas in the world, in South America, for instance, the hallucinogens were very popular, were often they originated from South American cultures. The drugs that cause hallucinations. And one could imagine, I used to use this in my teaching, said, well, imagine you were there and you go to your psychiatrist because you are depressed. And you say, well, I don't hear voices anymore, doc. So the I'll give you a good treatment for that. Hallucinogens were selling well. Oh, you hear voices? Oh, that's right. I'm recovered. I'm doing quite well now with these drugs. But after a time, you don't need them because you start hearing the voices anyway. Now, this is the sort of understanding what we need to reach, and stories like that about how other people see life, other people see understand depression, what depression is very is what we want to learn about, not to try, not to say what is schizophrenia in your language. Oh, you don't have one. Well, I mean, you're pretty ignorant. It's sort of you're underdeveloped. Oh, you're underdeveloped. Of course, it won't. You have to develop this now. So you have to go and get educated to hear, to know what hearing voices means. It's schizophrenia. This is a sort of understanding we need across cultures. Similarly, I mean, there are, and these sort of understandings are developing now, I think, between peoples who are going with Western ideas to, say, Sri Lanka, and they study Buddhism, or they study, which, I mean, hearing voices is not an illness. That's, you'll be laughed at, actually. It's, but it is now, since the 60s, 70s, because there are, I mean, I'll give you stories to demonstrate this, but I won't.
Should we move on to the next question?
It's been changed.
Questions in the room, sorry
Yes.
to cut you, Suman, but we have 3 questions also on the chat.
Should we ask the room now if there's any more questions?
Does anybody have any more questions in the room? Victor?
Sorry. Oh, yeah. And one here after, yeah.
More recent research in psychiatry and psychology show positive results on recreational drugs being used as therapy, and it does show positive and significant results. What's your take on this?
Sorry, what drugs being used this is?
Recreational drug use.
Oh, I see.
In controlled environments, under the supervision of healthcare and psychologists, I suppose.
Oh, gosh. I don't think there's an easy answer to that, because this is this is something that has to be decided locally, actually. What you decide locally, whatever it is, that's the best approach to recreational drugs, should not be transferred as a dogma of psychiatric teaching and taught to people in other countries and other regions. It's a local. There are so many other dimensions of recreational drug use. There's in the 60s, it was a big issue, whether cannabis was causing schizophrenia. And before that was whether cannabis was causing rioting in Broadwater Farm, I remember. And there was a psychiatrist who gave evidence in Birmingham, one of the areas where there was riots by black people. You know, they were like mad, you see, and he said, well, it's very clear that it was the cannabis. It was a cannabis psychosis, and they were psychotic. Protest Psychosis, that book. It's a very interesting book. And that sort of the discussions in America was that the civil rights movement, the violence in the civil rights movement, was caused by drugs. Was it caused by drugs, or was it mental illness? And there was this, you know, it was very anything but white supremacy. It wasn't white supremacy that was causing this. So they looked for something else, and those are the things that were actually selected, and that was transferred here too in the 70s. So there are various dimensions to this, the recreational drugs. We have to make, you know, I think we have to make decisions here because it's a very law-abiding country. I mean, some places where these laws don't matter very much, then you can be very loose on it and leave it to recreational drugs to have its to get integrated into the culture. If it's causing a lot of disruption, you have to think again as to how you deal with that disruption. But it might not be the drugs; it might be something else that's causing the disruption. In America, they suppressed alcohol, isn't it? Long time. Prohibition, because it was causing illness, what they call almost illness.
Thank you.
There was one more question here in the room.
Yeah. Thank you, Suman. As a current practitioner, in trying to think through what does it mean to decolonize the current practice of psychiatry, the only logical conclusion that I can come to is it means that you must dismantle Western psychiatry, DSM, the ICD-11 as it exists now. How do you conceptualize what a decolonial Western psychiatric practice looks like?
Decolonization is, you know, it means lots of different things. We had a meeting actually, you know, part of the CPM. I had some meetings with interested group, 10 or 12 of us last year, and everybody had a completely different interpretation of what decolonization means. And it's often following those meetings anyway, I got immersed in the literature on decolonization, and a lot of literature is from South America. I could read the English bits from it, not the Spanish and Portuguese, but there it's a very, you know, the what it means in practice to decolonize is seen very differently. I don't go into the differences. I can't really go into differences here, but than it is in North America and Britain, decolonization, because the experience of colonization was different too, and it probably is different in Australia. So decolonization would be something different. If Australians get together and talk about this, to have a decolonization that affects the world is a tremendous job. And I've been we are in the middle with 4 or 5 people devised a website which should be out, to which we hope to launch next 3 or 4 months. Indeed, just waiting for agreement for us to wait, as a sort of platform to try and bring about a sort of pragmatic approach, because it could be, I would see it as a way in which we can improve psychiatry for the people who are currently seeking psychiatry. That's users, which again is different to the people who were seeking psychiatry 100 years ago. They're different people. So to serve the users, that is, it's a user-driven. Using decolonization, looking at how colonialism affected the thinking, and trying to counteract that as much as possible. Decolonial, there's a lot of literature too on colonial thinking. What is colonial thinking? And again, it varies from place to place. But there is a lot of similarities in the British Empire, because of the British had a similar sort of approach in the empire. So, but it's the word it has become colonized. It's become actually taken for people to hang everything they want changed. Say, well, that's decolonization. A thing like medicalization was not a colonial thing. Look at the Maristans. That wasn't a colonial venture. That wasn't. That is a highly medicalized system of psychiatry that was in the mental hospitals in the caliphates. So medicalization is there's a sort of stereotype that medicalization is Western, and non-Western places think in sort of wishy-washy spiritual terms. That it's spirit, it's all spiritual. It's not. I mean, they're both, in both. So decolonization is very complex. Perhaps you have to drop the word, but at the word attracts attention, and we could use that word to actually try and change psychiatry and psychology into something that is valuable for people who consider themselves in need of that. It's a sort of user-driven psychology. I don't know if that's one way of getting out of this pragmatic approach.
We're just going to do one question from the online room again, or I'm going to do 2 together. So one is from Shahid. Thanks for the very thought-provoking presentation. I understand that you suggested that people can either be racist or non-racist, i.e. they can't stand on the fence. If so, can this argument be transferred to a broader concept, such as injustice and disadvantage? Can people be seen as either supporting disadvantage or fighting disadvantage? So there's a bit of a philosophical point there. And then I'm just going to pose the question from Bhavna as well. I have a question regarding racialized disasters. Do you think there is a difference in the experience of disaster with a colonized history and a racialized person? Do you think that those racialized can have no disaster history?
So that those racialized?
In disaster, experiences of disaster with a colonial history.
Experience disaster. I don't know. That's too much for me. I don't know how you experience disaster. I mean, is there one experience of disaster? I mean, disaster is, I've experienced all sorts of disasters, but they are, I think many people wouldn't think they're disasters at all.
Right.
They'll be happy experience, the whole question, what is a disaster? It's a,
Yeah.
so it's,
So Bhavna said to ask.
it's very complicated.
Yes, they write. I asked this question to distinguish whether, as racialized people, is there a layer or difference of that experience due to colonialism? Should each person from a racialized background be considered through the lens of these histories?
Racialization is again, these words are all complicated, but it's people who are, I'd see it as people who are seen as if they were racist. And going back to sort of Fanon stuff, that the othering is almost a normal thing, you might say. I feel an affinity for other people who speak the same language, who come from the same village or the same country or the same nation, the same, I feel, and the others, I always feel, is the other. You feel you could be threatened by the other. And to feel strongly about your own group means you might feel hostile to the other group. There's always that risk, and that's othering. And othering, you might say, well, it's normal, really. It's a matter of controlling that, not letting it get out of hand, and you don't actually go about killing people because they are the other. You don't, and you treat them with respect, etc. Othering is, always feel that. Racialization is a form of othering, where you're treated, immigrants or refugees are treated, whether they are white or whatever they look like, they are treated as if they are a race. So, in terms of invasions, presently talked about in the press, the invasions of immigrants, whether they are all the people who come by boat are invaders. They'll fall into that group. They are racialized as a racial group, as if they were a race. We don't like that. They ought to be put out. They ought to be expelled. So that's racialization. You're treated as if you're another race, because racism is so well understood. We know what racism is, and we racialize other people because they're like a race. They're like another race.
So just to add on Shahid's questions about supporting or fighting disadvantage, either or, is there any room as a psychiatrist or a future psychiatrist or mental health professionals in the room, can going into this now what you call the broken system, can they fight disadvantage? Can they be that? Is there space for individuals to make a difference in fighting disadvantage in the current system?
Well, I can't see why not. I mean, somehow I don't know why one's querying that. I mean, you may have other priorities. you may be racist yourself, and feel that it's more important to get rid of these alien races than help the disadvantaged help people who are disabled or something, physically disabled. We all have priorities ultimately, depending on our own experiences and our own, depending on our own experiences, our own backgrounds. we do have, we do, you know, say, well, I'm going to work about anti-racism because but it doesn't mean that gender discrimination is any better or worse. But other people do that. Can't do everything.
Thank you. It just leads us to one more question from the online audience. So Graham asked, thank you, Suman, your comment on psychiatry hitting rock bottom. What do you think should be the significant steps required in transcultural education in order to move the profession towards a more positive position?
Yeah. Remember when I was more active, people in high places used to consult me saying, well, give us the 3 things that should be done to change psychiatry. I mean, that question I used to think was, well, you know, I'm not going to take any notice of you anyway, so just give us something that I can say. I mean, there aren't any 3 things. There aren't any 1 thing. There might be hundreds. There might be. It depends on the situation. And I think a lot of these questions, actually, I find Kendi's book is really, I keep rereading it. I mean, people say, well, can black people be racist? Oh, chapter 7 or something. And because his book is the sort of book I would have liked to have written, in the sense I've been proud to have written, because he brings himself into it, you know. How to be anti-racist is how he became anti-racist from being racist. As a civil rights movement worker, he realized that he was being racist, and he is now nearly anti-racist. He's moved. It's actually a partly self-awareness, as well as says his first book was about the history of racism in the US from the beginning. You know, racism was actually there from the beginning. It wasn't that racism was introduced into the US. It was there when it started, when the US started the college. And and he has to say about that. He says you need to know, it is quite useful if you're trying to be, you know, constructive, to know how these things start. Racism started. But once you know how it started, you can throw it away. And you work with what is going on now. And his analogies for a doctor, he as a doctor, was quite striking. He says he had 4th degree cancer of the bowel, given him 6 months life expectancy at the time, and he embarked on every single how they treated it, and how people are treated now increasingly is, if you have a secondary, your secondary is treated as it were, as a neoplasm. In my time, when I was practicing, if you have secondaries, you go into a ward for people who are dying. Might be 2 or 3 years, but you know, you don't get any more treatment really. But now every secondary is treated. You don't need to know where the primary was. This is racism that way. You need to know the primary in order to understand a bit about the secondary. But when you come to treat it, and you come to be anti-racist, you do what is necessary, or what is important is what works now in the present situation, in the psychology, in your your family, in your, in England, in South America, all of it, it's variable. It's the context that has to be taken on board. It's the context as to how it's being perpetuated.
Thank you. I think we have one more question from Caitlin, and then we have to finish. If it's really quick, we can do both Caitlin and Alison. Caitlin first.
My question is it possible that the racism that exists in psychiatry and psychology actually has influence on the neglect on people who actually might need help, even though people who are raised, who have been discriminated against might not actually need help, but because they have a different race than psychologists, they ignore the people who actually need help.
I don't quite get that. Is it that when you that you maybe that I as a psychiatrist might have someone coming to see me who is racist? No. It's
so is it possible that the racism in the psychology
that racism itself is a pathology, is an illness.
Yeah.
Being racist is an illness. Yes, I think that's something that keeps cropping up, and it's been written about quite a lot in some circles about should racism be treated like an illness, that it's a pathology, and it doesn't seem to taking Kenty's approach. You do what is best to try and change it, to try and get rid of racism and the context. To treating it as an illness doesn't seem to work. What it'll just be, you are seen as a sick person, and the treatments for that sickness. Anyway, one can't see how this treatment for that sickness can work in making the changes that you need to make yourself. There is written several books in Britain. Now I can't remember her name. Psychotherapist there who works with people who taking this sort of approach that it's a sort of illness, and that it's a pathology that one needs to counteract. So there may be something in that, but the general view is, I think, that it wouldn't work. The treatment approach, and I'm sure there have been drug firms researching to see whether they can find a drug that they can advertise as being treatment for racism, because it'll make a lot of money, but it wouldn't last.
Thank you. Was there one question either from Alison or the audience here?
Yeah, I'm going to ask it. So obviously you mentioned a lot about the colonial period before, and the central tendency is the shift from universal to pluriversal. And I guess in that sense, in what ways can psychologists benefit by shifting from universal to pluriversal?
Can you repeat that? I couldn't.
Could you speak a little bit louder?
Sure. In what ways can psychodisciplines benefit from shifting from universal to pluriversal?
Shifting from the universal to pluriversal. How can the psi disciplines benefit from that shift?
From universal
to pluriversal.
What is pluriversal? My language is limited.
So obviously, assuming the fact that everybody has a common experience of rural, it's accounting for different social cultural circumstances, worldview, etc.
Right, so the plural view versus just one
I
view
see.
is right.
Yes, I see what you mean. Yes, that there is one thing that it's there are very well. I think that's a very good question. I mean, that is there's the arguments last few years in Montreal particularly, and other places. It's been whether the global, there's a movement that is highly funded and supported by Harvard and the School for Studies in London, Australia, there are various places. The Movement for Global Mental Health, GMHA, and the WHO tends to fund it now. There seems to support it now. There is about spreading psychiatry, that it's only evidence-based psychiatry that should be taught and spread, and that you should look for evidence in different places. Sure, the evidence in America may not be relevant to what is best for Indian community. And it's a matter of getting the evidence. The opposing view was that it's local. Mental health, mental illness is a local phenomenon and not a universal phenomenon. It's not the same everywhere. And your pluralism is it's a matter of, perhaps in practice, one has to decide where how wide the area is. If you're running a service, how wide the area is that you're aiming to improve services. And there are ongoing debates on that in academic circles. The extremes are sort of coming together. The extremes were, I was on the local branch that mental health and mental illness are local phenomena and can only be understood and treated locally and local people. The opposite was Vikram Patel, who you may have heard of, who espoused the view that it's only global approach because we can't get the evidence necessary unless unless the evidence is obtained from one source can be used somewhere else. So it's a sort of scientific debate. And they're both views, I think. We need compromises because the world is seeming to be much more cohesive than I thought. I thought it was very different. I thought Sri Lankan culture was completely different to European, and had a great job, sort of, although I came from middle class English speaking, there's a great job in psychiatry, psychology to coming to terms with what was taught as science. I still think this is not science, but it has certain advantages, and one has to have a middle path. This is my Buddhist background, I think, that the middle way is ultimately, one has to find a middle way. Call it a compromise, a middle way. And I think in the academic circles, America and Canada, not so much Australia, in Britain, they're coming together into some sort of compromise, because we have to think in large areas.
Thank you, Suman. I think we should finish this. We're just running out of our time of finishing this event at 8 o'clock. So thank you so much for the questions. Sorry we couldn't address them all. Thank you so much, Suman Fernando, for visiting us. And big applause to Suman. And I hope to see you again on another event by the Centre. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Right, well,
Thank you so much.
very well conducted.
Thank you, everyone.